With so much more to go over in the viewership and the media rights space, bringing in an expert in the space this week, someone with their finger on the pulse of all things sports media, William Mao, Octagon Senior Vice President of Global Media Rights, a returning SBJ Sports Media Podcast champion. Good to have you back on the pod, Will.
Thanks for having me, Austin. Who's this expert we're bringing in?
It's you, buddy. It's you, buddy. We're gonna start off with some Four Nations talk. That Four Nations face-off event, essentially conjured out of thin air by the NHL and the NHLPA. Obviously, some huge returns there for ESPN and TNT, especially compared to what maybe like an NHL All-Star Weekend would have drawn. But what did you see in the Four Nations face-off numbers?
Look, anytime you can combine national pride and mix it up with the specter of a fight breaking out, I think you have a recipe for some must-see television. If there's any reason why the UFC as a property and WWE as a property are growing in popularity and value, that's an indication of that. But seriously speaking, great content. Obviously, they had some great games. And what was super surprising to us when we were looking at the numbers was the fact that the final, which was on ESPN, outrated all 7 of the Stanley Cup finals from last year, right? That were on ABC.
Yep.
Which is pretty surprising.
Yeah, not even on TNT. Those games were on ABC last year, which is even more impressive.
Absolutely. And then when it comes to this year, it's the only property outside of CFP broadcasts and NFL broadcasts on ESPN that cracked the top 10 so far. So pretty impressive numbers. I think it's super cool. The one thing I thought about in the back of my mind, though, with all these great numbers and the fact that it did outrate the Stanley Cup finals last year, is it necessarily something the NHL wants that their, crown jewel event is being outrated by an exhibition they put together, right? So it's just something to think about from an overall property perspective. But I think one other winner outside of this is NBC, with Olympics being 2026 and hockey being in it. I think that this is a good signal and it bodes well for them.
I think there's also a little bit of a trickle-down effect in the NHL, too. I was over at NESN headquarters earlier this week, and obviously the game USA-Canada was in Boston, and they told me that their Saturday Bruins matchup was one of the most watched games of their season.
Yeah, we did see a couple of the post-Four Nations broadcasts being able to ride that wave a little bit, right? So I think that also is a good sort of harbinger for the second half of NHL.
I am curious to see, though, if that does stay. I get the immediate impact coming off of All-Star Weekend. You had the fervor from those USA-Canada games. But I am interested to see if TNT, if ESPN can continue to ride the coattails of that event through the course of the back half of the season. I'm not sure it lasts, much longer after these next, week or two.
That's fair. Well, let's look at another recent event, NBA All-Star. So that event clearly does need some adjustments. Again, as noted by our colleague Tom Friend in this week's SBJ Magazine cover story. Will, how have All-Star numbers looked over the past few years?
Yeah, if we look at both the kind of two main events of All-Star Weekend, Saturday night and then the All-Star Game, ratings overall have been, kind of in a stall, right? And to the NBA's credit, they have been willing to try format changes, new ideas over the past 5 to 7 years for both Saturday night and the All-Star Game itself, and some have had varying degrees of success, little bits of pops, things like, Curry versus Ionescu in a three-point contest, Elam ending player drafts have come to play in the All-Star Game. Give them credit for being willing to experiment, and I will say that on a macro level, this isn't an issue that is unique to the NBA. I think all All-Star type competitions and exhibitions had their own version of this type of struggle, right? You see all the transformations that the NFL has done. So this is not a NBA unique question. I do think that, there isn't a single magic bullet that is going to solve this problem for the NBA or anybody else. One thing you do need, obviously, is your headline players, your top 1 through 5 players not only participating probably in the All-Star Game, but taking a level of participation in All-Star Saturday night. And then obviously having everybody play hard and care about it, right? One of the things that I looked at was, when they instituted the player draft in 2018, the idea was hopefully that would bring some more heat to the competition of the actual game. But over the couple of years, what actually probably transpired more was that the draft itself, the picking of the teams became the spectacle, and then the game itself maybe didn't necessarily get the result that was hoped for. And so is that a question of there's too much exposure of these players already. So the novelty of having these players playing with each other isn't as much of a thing as the fact that player movement is so frequent these days through trades and free agent signing that like the idea of player A playing with player B isn't as like unique anymore because it could potentially happen next season. And so, like I said, it's a combination of things. I don't think it's one single factor that is driving this issue.
Well, if there's anything close to a silver bullet, I don't even know if it's going to be a silver bullet. And it seems like the fans want to see USA versus the world on that Sunday game. And you talk about maybe there are enough, international players to fill out a back half of a roster on that sort of thing, maybe those last 4 to 5 slots. But I still think that is what fans would want to see in a game. That is what would really drive up interest on that Sunday. As far as Saturday and All-Star night, the skills contest, it's not really for me. The dunk contest, okay, a lot of people like watching it. I'd like to see some, more high-profile names than a G leaguer like Mac McClung. I'd like to see some star NBA players get back into that sort of competition. But, like we saw last year, if next year you are able to have some sort of Caitlin Clark versus Steph Curry or another NBA player in a three-point shootout, that is something that I think would be incredibly popular and really, boost that number up to numbers that we haven't seen in a long time for Saturday at least.
I do think it's funny that people are counting on a WNBA player to boost the NBA All-Star weekend.
That's a fair point. I was going to say, going back to your comment, Austin, about sort of USA versus the world. Obviously, the NHL has done that before in terms of their All-Star weekend kind of competition. The NBA had done it, if I recall, when they were doing rookie, sophomore, or rising stars competitions. They would split the teams, not necessarily rookie and sophomore. They also, I think, at one point experimented USA versus the world. Question is, like, the fact that we barely maybe remember that fact would suggest maybe that not necessarily is a silver bullet. Maybe it's a recency bias because the Summer Olympics had such great competition on a national team level. And obviously, the Four Nations might be a good signal that like doing something like that would actually be popular as well.
There's also a few startup leagues that began early this year. TGL, Unrivaled. How have these new leagues been doing so far?
Let's start with TGL, right? And I think there's been about nine or 10 matches to date, broadcast matches, however you want to count them. They started out pretty hot. We're getting close to 1 million on ESPN, and then it's kind of trailed off a little bit. I will say that having a couple of their broadcasts during the Monday of President's Day weekend, maybe, was part of the reason the numbers are a little down more recently compared to the start. But I think the key thing that, maybe as a programmer at ESPN, you're looking at is like, what's the performance over a replacement player, right? So if you use like a baseball analogy, are you doing better than somebody else that could slot in? And so if you look at those same time slots that TGL has been in, over its first 9 matches compared to the programming that was in those time slots in 2024, on average, they're outpacing it by about 20%. And so that's a good signal for the property. I think one other thing that people were expecting or hoping was that, the broadcast where Tiger's team was participating with like over index, right? The Tiger Woods effect. And thus far, we really haven't necessarily seen that. But, it's still early days.
And he didn't even play this week. On Tuesday night, he did not play. That was a game that was going up against that Mavericks-Lakers game, Luka's return against the Mavericks. And Tiger didn't even play, so maybe that leads to, probably a better number there for that TNT NBA game.
That's TGL. What are you thinking about Unrivaled?
It's been very cool to see, obviously, greater investment in women's sports and women's basketball. Clearly, the thing that really popped for them is that one-on-one, 1v1 tournament they had during the season, the middle of the season. The casualty of that was Breanna Stewart getting skunked in one of those broadcasts, but that obviously trended very much on social. I think what's really interesting is that seemed to afterwards, if you look at the traditional games that they had afterwards, particularly on the broadcasts that were just exclusive to True TV, you do see kind of a little bit of a bump in terms of the average post that tournament compared to the games that were broadcast beforehand. I keep focusing on this 1v1 tournament. Should Unrivaled or even the NBA focus more on the idea of Queen of the Mountain, King of the Mountain, in terms of its competition? I recall over NBA All-Star Weekend, going back to that topic a little bit, that there's some trending on social when there was some questions being asked of these All-Stars, like, hey, of all these guys, if you were to do a one-on-one tournament, who would win, right? I remember Anthony Edwards was like, I don't care who it is, I'm going to win, right? Everyone thinks they're going to win. And so is that an idea that maybe the NBA can think about in terms of of supercharging All-Star Weekend a little bit, because that is something that people wouldn't necessarily see through the player movement in the NBA, is the idea of people playing one-on-one. So again, Molly, to your point, whether it's infusing All-Star Weekend with WNBA players or taking a key from the creativity and the willingness to try things at a property like Unrivaled has been for women's basketball, maybe that those are things that could help the NBA as well.
I totally agree with you, Will. That 1v1 idea was fantastic. I think the NBA could borrow from that, and it was a really smart thing by Unrivaled. But on the flip side, like Molly said, Caitlin Clark might be what is needed to save All-Star Saturday, but it's also what's going to be needed to, I think, in the long term, save Unrivaled. The numbers aren't what I thought they were in this first season, so I think that you definitely need to get her involved in the future if this is going to be a long-term property.
Well, I'm headed down to Miami in a couple weeks for the last weekend of the regular season of Unrivaled, so I'm looking forward to seeing it in person.
All right, well, Octagon is also a media rights advisor for the reconstituted Pac-12. A new media rights deal does seem close. What's the latest there?
We're deep in the process, having talked with the market since we were brought on in the late fall last year. We've been really excited about the market response and the demand and the interest for the new Pac-12. Right now, we're working through that's kind of the devil in the details a lot with each of the interested parties in terms of volume and quality and making sure all the puzzle pieces fit together. I often say in this process that we kind of have a double-edged sword situation with the Pac-12. And on the one hand, you don't have to be restricted by the idea of existing packages and reserved rights that you might have to kind of navigate in a traditional media rights deal with existing partners and such. You have a really blank slate, right? You get to be very creative and talk to anybody about any sort of formulation of a rights package. On the flip side, because you're not anchored around any existing packages to get from step 0 to step 1 and then step 1 to step 2 to really get going on these conversations, you're going to have to kind of bring ideas to the table, right? In terms of conversation, you're not kind of working around an existing construct. And so that has been kind of the nature of this conversation, where we're bringing folks in and we're having conversations more so from the perspective of not these are the rights, but what do you want? What can we do? How can we be creative? How can we stand out in a constantly evolving college landscape? Overall, very excited. We're deep in the process, and we're continuing to kind of talk to the market. That's kind of what I would characterize the situation as.
So you're not going to tell us who the partners are right now?
Anything I would say now is not probably going to be the reality of the situation. I think the one thing that even the commissioner has said publicly in some of her recent comments is we expect that there will likely be more than one partner. I don't think that's any sort of revelation, just given how the college rights have in recent deals been split across multiple parties of late. And so, that's just indicative of where the market is going. And so we anticipate that that's what's going to take place here. And as a consequence of that, you're trying to fit multiple puzzle pieces together, right? And so that's usually the 3 yards in a cloud of dust period, to use a football analogy of what we're trying to do right now.
Well, we had to try and break some news.
I like the hard sell, Molly.
Can't fault you guys for trying.
All right, well, I do want to touch on some other recent media rights decisions, specifically on ESPN's side. I'm talking about F1 and MLB. ESPN obviously saying we're not going to be part of the bidding for F1. They're paying around, 90, 95 million, 85 million, something like that per season right now. Our boss, Abe Macor, broke in the magazine this week that they're looking for somewhere between 160 and 180 million annually. That wasn't something that ESPN wanted to be involved in. MLB, conversely, that $550 million deal that ESPN was paying, they opted out of that. What do you think about the two decisions there for ESPN vis-a-vis F1 and MLB?
I would say that all of these parties are doing what they feel is kind of the best for their business, right? And all, starting with MLB and that situation with ESPN, I think it makes a lot of sense from the MLB side of the conversation that they don't want to accept a decrease in the value of that content and in that deal, particularly when you look at sort of the other places where they're already going to have to deal with a retrench in value. And what I'm talking about is obviously the local market side, right? And so when you're already kind of dealing with that kind of issue here, perhaps, you're trying to put a stake in the ground in terms of like at least your national rights and the value that you currently are establishing in that. From ESPN's perspective, as been communicated, perhaps their position is that, well, MLB itself repriced its own value on the national level by some of the recent deals they did in terms of, cost per game or cost per hour relative to that ESPN deal. And if the two circles of a Venn diagram don't intersect, I think maybe it just does make sense to walk away and give each other opportunity to go explore other opportunities. And I would say that's probably the same case for F1, right? Like, one side has an estimation of value that maybe doesn't intersect at all with the other side. And, you got ultimately at the end of the day, everybody's operating businesses. And so even if there isn't a universe of negotiation or compromise, that doesn't necessarily mean one party doesn't like the other party or doesn't see any value in one another. It's just that the value doesn't match maybe currently in terms of expectation. The last more stepping back lens on this is, if you look at it, perhaps is ESPN signaling that a little bit of I'll call it a double down strategy, right? In terms of some of the recent investments they made, things in like NBA, obviously NFL, kind of a couple of years ago, their continued investment in things like college sports. Those are kind of almost like the tier ones of the tier ones in our market. And so is it a double down strategy, which also it makes a lot of sense, kind of continue to invest in the things that are really, really driving and pulling the sled up the hill? That could be part of what this entire approach is from a rationalization perspective.
Definitely be fiscally responsible up there in Bristol. Totally get that. But, it sounds like you're giving a dating analogy here with MLB and ESPN. And yeah, I think they're broken up and they might date some people, see what it goes like. But I think at the end of the day, I think there might be some spark there at the end and maybe they can get back together on some sort of deal. We'll see.
Look at what happened with the NHL. They were gone for what, 10 years and came back.
We'll go back to one of our original topics, the NBA, right? Like, think about how long it's been since it's been on NBC and going to be back there.
Old flames. Love them getting back together.
Love is blind. Last question for you. So we've talked about Pac-12. We know F1, UFC, some others are up for grabs. What's a more niche property you've got your eyes on?
I will fully acknowledge right off the bat, maybe I'm being a little selfish and shilling for our own clients, but we're really excited for Major League Rugby and the sport of rugby in our market. We were just fortunate enough to help them negotiate a deal with ESPN here in the U.S., which also has tentacles out to some international markets, and we're excited to be able to also probably be able to announce some additional international distribution for Major League Rugby in the coming days. And, for those in the audience, the tune-in audience that are not familiar, Major League Rugby is the domestic rugby union property in the United States. Been in operation for a number of years, is already the most watched rugby in our market. And with the Rugby World Cup coming to the U.S. At the end of the decade, this is the platform that's going to build that fandom in our market.
All right. Well, Will, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And I'll be hounding you about that Pac-12 deal.
I wouldn't expect anything else. Thanks for having me, guys.